well, I am gonna get started here. The door is closed, and so hopefully if anybody else needs to get in here, they can catch up. Or they can come to one of the other talks that I'm giving on this topic in the next couple of weeks. There'll be a lot of the same information. And so I am both the host and the speaker today. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Dr. Sara Ruane, and I am the Women's Board Associate Curator of Herpetology, which we probably all know as Reptiles and Amphibians, as well as the director of the core labs here at the Field Museum. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is this awesome exhibit that is opening in just a couple of weeks now, Reptiles Alive. And this is going to be a mixture of really amazing information that highlights several of the live animals that will be in the exhibit, as well as just some, I don't know, some insider secrets about the development of the exhibit and things that I thought were really important as it progressed. So I want to say that secretly we can all refer to the exhibit instead of calling it Reptiles Alive. I myself call it Reptiles Round the World, which is maybe what I proposed as the name for it. And this is really an homage to a former curator here by the name of Clifford Pope. Pope was a curator here from 1940 to 1954, and he wrote a book called Reptiles Round the World. He also wrote a book called The World of Reptiles. One was the Reptiles Around the World book is really for the general public, the non-expert in the field. And then his other book was one that was more scientific in nature. So I like to think about Pope when we were developing this exhibit because it really does focus on reptiles from all over the world. And reptiles live pretty much everywhere except where it is super, super, super cold. So just to introduce myself a little bit more for anybody who I haven't met in person before, who doesn't know me and is coming because they're so excited just about this exhibit. So the work that I do in my lab really seeks to describe and quantify global herpetofaunal diversity, so reptiles and amphibians. But anybody who actually really knows me knows that I really focus primarily only on snakes and very little else. Sometimes other fancy lizards, but mostly snakes. And an emphasis on snake systematics. So snake evolution, numbers of snakes, diversification, those sorts of things. And this is all accomplished through a combination of fieldwork, using genetic or molecular data, morphological data, and then a lot of collaborations. This could be called collaborations around the world, actually. And so ever since I was a little kid, I loved going out and catching animals and putting them in jars. You know, they didn't then go on a shelf, right? These animals were alive, but I loved going out and catching lightning bugs with my grandmother on Saturday night when I would stay over her house. I loved when my grandfather would be sorting through his compost pile and grabbing centipedes and pill bugs and putting them in jars. My grandmother used to save things like peanut butter jars, and I can remember her getting a big nail and heating it up on her gas stove to poke holes in the lid and burn through them so that these things would have air holes. And so catching insects and other invertebrates is easy to do just in someone's backyard. But the best thing was that my grandmother and my grandfather would take me almost every Sunday, as long as the weather was cooperative, out somewhere locally in the woods where we would go out and go on a hike and go on a walk with their dog. And I would always want to flip over rocks and logs and see what was underneath. And my grandmother in particular was very encouraging with this. So I would then catch things like salamanders, frogs, etc. But seeing a snake and catching that was always the utmost prize because snakes don't usually wait around for you to think about it, right? You either go for it or the snake is gone. Sometimes they stay still, but a lot of the times they're just on their way out the door very quickly. So the adrenaline rush from catching snakes is something I've had in me ever since I was a little kid. And I can also remember this book in particular, which is also featured in the Changing Face of Science exhibit that is currently upstairs that I'm featured in as well. Snakes and Snake Hunting. This is a book that the local Scranton Public Library had available. They probably had 5 books related to herpetology. And I just took the same books out over and over and over and over because it was a very limited resource. And there was no internet or anything. That's actually that picture from 1994 is the ball python that a lot of you have probably met when I brought him in for different events. His name is Coolio, which also goes back to circa 1994 because I thought it was very cool. That's in front of my grandmother's house. It was really working with a herpetology professor when I was an undergrad at UMass Amherst that got me on the road to academics. Up until I was an undergrad, I didn't really know how, I knew I wanted to be a herpetologist. I said it in 5th grade to my teacher. I did not know how you made that happen. There was no internet, there was no obvious way unless maybe you already knew somebody who worked at a university. And so I really didn't know how you accomplished that until I met this herpetology professor who I worked with and worked for the 4 years during my undergrad as a work study student. And he said, you know, if you want to work with animals, you don't need to be a veterinarian or work at a zoo. You can actually do research on wild animals, which I found far more appealing. And so in 2004, that photo in the middle is when I did an internship down in Florida where I was catching rat snakes and rattlesnakes, and that's a cottonmouth that's in that tube right there. And so that was sort of my first taste of doing real research kind of work. And I then went on and dabbled a little bit in ecological work for my master's degree, where I was working on turtle nest site selection, specifically Blanding's turtles, which while I was in Nebraska, we have them here in Illinois. They're one of our endangered species here, but they're around if you know where to look. And what I realized from working on turtles for a couple of years is that by the time I was ready to do a PhD, I wanted to only work on snakes and systematics and evolution. As much as I love turtles and ecological work, it really helped me focus on what I wanted to do long term. And so museum-based research has been a key part of my program throughout my entire academic career. When I was doing my PhD on snakes, I spent a lot of time at the American Museum of Natural History and looked at a lot of specimens there. I ultimately did a postdoc there. I did a second postdoc at Louisiana State University's Museum of Natural Science, did a short stint as a professor at Rutgers, and now I'm here, still doing collections-based work. But I will say, the thing that got me excited as a kid was live animals, right? Going out and catching these things is what makes me most excited, and that has not shifted throughout all of these years, as much as I love museums and the collections as well. And so Reptiles Alive is this Field Museum exclusive exhibit. It opens to everybody on June 20th, and it's going to run for about 10 months. It's a mix of museum models, specimens, and live reptiles, of course. With a name like that, there better be live reptiles. It's got a focus on both local, right here in Illinois and in the northeastern or eastern part of the US, as well as global. There are reptiles represented from, I think, every single continent in this exhibit, not Antarctica, but that doesn't count because there's no reptiles there. And it also features a little bit of my research as well, specifically some of the work that I've done with interns here at the Field Museum. And so I'll talk a little bit about that at the end as well. I'm going to take you on a tour of some of the coolest animals that are in this exhibit and some unknown information that you might not get just from seeing them in a tank. So the first thing I want to talk about that is one of our live reptiles that'll be here starting in just a couple of weeks is the Gila monster. And so it's pronounced the same way as the Gila River. Sometimes people want to say Gila. It's one of 2 venomous lizards that exist in the world. It's very close relative. The Mexican beaded lizard is also venomous. Lives in the southwestern US in really arid, dry, rocky places. Spends, 90% might be generous. This thing lives underground in a burrow almost all the time. It comes out a couple times a year when it rains, eats as much as it can, and then it goes and sits in a burrow. So it spends most of its life just hanging out underground. And when it does come out, what it is looking to do is eat things that are easy and don't put up a big fight. Baby birds, bird eggs, so ground nesting birds, they don't really climb, as well as small mammals, and especially like a nest of baby mice would be a real smorgasbord for this thing. The thing about Gila monsters is they don't have fangs the way we think about fangs in something like snakes, the way we think about a rattlesnake and its fangs. A Gila monster and the way it gets venom into what it's eating is quite different. So first up, in snakes that are venomous, it's typically the 2 front teeth or 2 teeth in the front of the mouth that inject venom. In Gila monsters, it's actually in the lower jaw, and it's in the back of the lower jaw that really has the venom area. And even then, it's not this beautiful duct system that you see that's quite sophisticated in something like a cobra or a rattlesnake. Instead, it's these glands, salivary glands in the lower jaw, and the Gila monster just sort of chews into what it's eating, and the venom gets chewed into it. And so this isn't an animal that lunges and strikes. It's an animal that waddles up to what it's going to eat and just kind of starts going at it. And so it's forced through the little venom ducts or the little salivary ducts that are down there towards the teeth. You can see there's little holes along where the teeth are. Just by the sheer capillary action, the chewing motion, it's not a muscle control where the animal decides it's going to squeeze the venom out. It just happens naturally. And what I'll say is the bite from a Gila monster is not typically a problem for humans. It's pretty weak as far as working against us. But there isn't any antivenom available for it because it's not really needed. In general, antivenom is not made for animals, for snakes or lizards that are not considered medically significant. Oh, wrong way, sorry. But just because it's not medically significant from a venom standpoint doesn't mean that it's not medically significant from a helping humans medically in a totally different way. So Gila monsters, back in the 90s, it was determined that Gila monsters have this venom protein called exendin 4. And that exendin 4 venom protein is something that regulates glucose release. It's a little unclear what it does in the prey animals that a Gila monster is going to eat, but it definitely is one of the components of the venom. And in the 1990s, it was found that this is very similar to this glucagon-like peptide, GLP-1. It's a derivative that works for a really long time in humans. And it was originally developed to work in diabetes patients to help with glucose release, insulin control. But for anybody who, I don't know, has watched a television or seen an ad on the internet in the last year or so, you're probably familiar with drugs like Ozempic or Wegovy or all these other GLP-1s. And this is a derivative. These weight management drugs are all a derivative directly from this venom protein in Gila monster venom. And so this is a really important thing to keep in mind when you ever have to convince somebody, why should you like things like venomous snakes? Forget about, I mean, I would never forget about it, but forget about how we all love biodiversity and everything has a role in the ecosystem. This is something that directly impacts humans medically in a really positive, significant way. So that's something you won't learn in the exhibit, but now when you see that Gila monster, you can think about this and thank him for this amazing venom protein that he produces. The next thing I want to talk a little bit are some of the snakes that are in the exhibit, which are obviously my favorites. So for anybody who doesn't know this, snakes are just a kind of lizard. And this is something else you're going to learn right when you walk into the exhibit. There's a really nice audio visual display that goes through this, but I'm going to walk everyone through it in a more personal way. Snakes are a kind of lizard. They are nested within the family tree of lizards. They're not their own separate group of reptiles. But not all lizards are snakes, and that might seem obvious if they have legs. But there are legless lizards out there that are also not snakes. And so what makes them different? Why aren't they all snakes besides from an evolutionary standpoint? Looking at them physically, how do you know they're not snakes just by looking? And anybody who's familiar with snakes and lizards usually can tell the difference pretty fast. So right here, I've got a group of squamates, which is the group that we put lizards and snakes both in. And I'm not going to ask everyone in the audience to respond, but does anybody want to guess which one of these is actually a snake versus a lizard? They may have a single guess. The bottom right one. All right, so of course this was a trick question. They're all lizards. All right, but it's easy to think, oh, that one might be a snake, or some of these might be snakes, because I also told you one of them was. So I lied a little bit there, but it just goes to show that these really do. These are all legless lizards, and they're not just legless lizards. They're groups of legless lizards that are not closely related to each other either, nor are they closely related to snakes. And so what makes a snake, or how do we know that snakes come from lizards and that they're a kind of lizard? One of the first things that you can look at on some snakes is that you can still see, particularly on bigger, heavy-bodied snakes, you can actually still see the vestiges of where they had lower limbs. You can see their legs. And in some snakes in particular, like in this python skeleton right there, so this is an extant python that exists today. You can actually see there are bones in there too. It's not just a little fleshy doodad there down by the cloaca. It is actually something that is truly in there. Also, if we go back even further, one of the things as you go back in the fossil record is that snakes did come from a limbed ancestor. And one of the reasons we know this is because early snakes do have limb bones to some degree. Varies. And if you go back even further, you can argue about whether things are snakes or lizards because it gets harder and harder to tell. And that is not an area I'm an expert in, so I have no argument about that. But about 90 to 100 million years ago, we definitely had the lineage that leads to modern snakes today. Fossils that are identified accurately as snakes. And so when you look at modern extant lizards, and this is something when you walk around this exhibit, you can think about. You could think about lizards have a big hole in the side of their head. Most of them. This is biology. There's an exception probably to every single thing I'm going to say. So we don't need to talk about earless lizards because those also exist, of course. But in general, lizards are going to have a hole in the side of their head and have this external ear opening. Pretty obvious to see on that gecko right there. Whereas snakes, I don't have anything to point to because they don't have any external ear opening. Doesn't mean they're deaf in the sense that they hear nothing, but if they're hearing things, it's going to be much lower frequencies, more like hearing vibrations, feeling it through their lower jaws, especially if they're resting their heads on the ground. The other thing about snakes that really stands out when you compare them to other lizards is the kinesis. The kineticness of their skull is wild. So lizards that aren't snakes, we'll just call them all lizards anyway, even though technically snakes are lizards, as I said. The thing about lizards is that in general, of course, there's exceptions, big things like Komodo dragons. Most lizards eat invertebrates. They don't eat other vertebrates, and that's where snakes really excel. Because what snakes can do, it's shown in this extreme example of an egg-eating snake, they can not dislocate their jaws. Their jaws were never, their upper and lower jaws are not attached with bones or in a socket. They're attached by a stretchy ligament, so it's like having a rubber band there that they can stretch it all nice and vertical. But what is lesser realized by most people is that their lower jaw, the way ours is fused together, theirs is not. It also is just a ligament that holds these together, and the snake stretches that lower jaw horizontally as well. And so that's really what makes them able to eat super, super, super big stuff. Another thing when you look at a lizard versus a snake versus a legless lizard is that the tail on a lizard, so right there where that arrow is, that's the cloaca. That is the tail on, and this is a lizard, to be clear. The rest of it is body. The little gray area is its head. This is a lizard that obviously wants its head and its tail to look very similar to try to get predators to leave its head alone. But what I'll say is that the snake, there's where its cloaca is. You can see how much shorter its tail is relatively. Snakes, for their body size, have very short tails. And the body of a snake, we know its body, not just because we know because that's the right answer, but just looking at a skeleton. If you were to look at the skeleton of a snake versus a very typical lizard, what you'll see again is that the tail on the lizard is about half the length or even longer than the body. On the snake, every place you see a rib coming off of a vertebrae, that's the body, just like us, right? Our ribs are part of our body. They're not part of like our coccyx going down into a tail or anything like that. And so there on this particular snake, the tail is probably a sixth of the body, right? It's very, it's certainly less than a third. And so that's another time when you look at snakes, this is a very obvious way that you can say, yeah, you know what, this is why they're different. Just to show around the world as well is that legless lizards that aren't snakes are not incredibly uncommon either. We have them represented across all continents. Even in the United States, we have glass lizards right here in Illinois. I've caught them multiple times since I've been here, and they're legless. They are, you know, not necessarily easy to find, but they're not all that rare either. So these are all unrelated legless lizards found across the world. And that brings me to what is our live animal that goes with this and all this information is the legless lizard we're going to have in the exhibit that is super, super cool and very large. And so when we were putting the exhibit together, and I went with some of the folks from the exhibits team to where the animals are coming from, Clyde Keeling's Reptile Land in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, there were some animals that I thought were too pedestrian for the museum to host because they reminded me of things you could see very easily in a pet store. So we changed a few things out to better tell some interesting stories. And one of the stories I wanted to talk about was lizards and snakes. And the things I just told you all, I wanted to illustrate it. So we switched out one of the other animals with this large legless lizard, this European glass lizard. These are found in Europe and Central Asia. And legless lizards, not all of them, but many of them, including this one, can drop and have their tail just shatter into pieces when they feel threatened. So this is a way to escape from a predator. And these tails, whether it's on a legless lizard or on something like a gecko, when that tail breaks off, it flips around and it moves around quite wildly. In fact, if you're fixing something like a gecko and it is already deceased, its tail will keep twitching. And if you don't somehow immobilize it, it will twitch so hard it'll throw the tail right off even in death. Because I've had this happen. It doesn't make for a good specimen. I will point out the tail I'm showing you here is not from this particular species. The tail piece that I'm showing and how it breaks off is from our Illinois glass lizard in this state. So just to be clear, for anybody who wanted to say they weren't the same species, I know. Another of the big highlights for snakes in this exhibit is going to be pythons and boas. And we've got 3 representatives that are going to be in here. So first up, we've got something nice and big, about a 14-foot reticulated python. So that's a very large snake, and that'll be very exciting just to have here. I don't know if anyone's going to get the opportunity to see it feed, but it'll probably need to eat at least a couple of times while it's living here. Snakes this big often go several months between feeding, so it's not going to be that frequent. But there might be some special events where that happens. But besides just having this really big reticulated python, people think of boas and pythons, they're big, and that's what's impressive about them. But there are other equally interesting aspects. And so we're also going to have this arboreal snake, this green tree python, which was one of the animals already on the roster for coming with this exhibit. But I can't remember what I switched out with, but I thought, what I'd really love to do is make a comparison between green tree pythons and a very, very similar looking snake called the emerald tree boa. And this emerald tree boa, not this individual, but an emerald tree boa is highlighted in a lot of the media that's going to be shown and advertised for this exhibit, because it is a really gorgeous snake. And so why would I want to have 2 snakes that look kind of alike in the same exhibit? Why would that be interesting? And so a little background on boas and pythons. They're not particularly closely related to each other. You lump them into the same group because they have a lot of similarities. For example, in general, you find pythons more in the old world. You're going to find pythons around Africa, Asia, Australia. Boas are mostly New World, mostly American. There are some like those that get to Madagascar. And so it's not strict just because in biology, nothing ever is. But in general, pythons are Old World and boas are New World. Another thing that's very similar about them that people lump them in the same groups is they have some other qualities. They're constrictors that eat really large prey. This is a Burmese python down in Florida doing what people don't like, which is eating the local wildlife. They feed quite infrequently in general because they eat such big stuff. They're almost always going to be a sit and wait predator. They're large. They're not moving quickly to hunt things down. They're sitting in the same spot, maybe for a month at a time, waiting for just the right prey item to come along, and then they'll sit there for another 2 months. But another thing that's really cool about them is that they have these heat sensing pits. Do I have an arrow? Yes. They both boas and pythons, a lot of them have heat sensing pits that allows them to see, like if you put on infrared goggles in an action movie, they can see the thermal image of the food that they eat because they do typically want to eat mammals, nice warm-blooded stuff. And so with these heat sensing pits, they're able to do that. So you can see with all of these similarities that these snakes get grouped together all the time, even though they don't form a group, in and of themselves as a monophyletic group of snakes. And what's the reason? It's convergent evolution, which is one of, I think, the most elegant concepts we have in evolutionary biology. It's when 2 animals look, live, and act extremely similar. And to show just how convergent these boas and pythons, the green tree python, which is on the top, and the emerald tree boa, which is on the bottom, I want to point out it's not just they sit in the exact same way when they're sitting on trees. They have this very specific way of coiling their bodies when they're just hanging around. They do it exactly the same. And not only as adults do they look exactly alike, or alike enough that most people can't tell the difference. The babies, which are born a totally different color, are also very, very similar and often bright orange. They can be bright yellow. They can also be almost like a dark purple color. And in the same, I can't say, so boas have live babies. So in the same litter of boas or the same clutch, because pythons have eggs, you'll get this mixture of babies of all different colors. But when they grow up, they all look like this. Not because they're related though. The reason that you see this convergent evolution is because they're doing the same thing in their environment. They do the same job in their niche. And this is exactly what convergent evolution is. And I thought this would be a great concept to have in the exhibit for people to observe up close and personal and just see just how similar these snakes look to each other. I find the way they sit in particular really kind of mind-blowing, that this snake, I have a little more information here, but these snakes that look so similar and do the same exact behaviors. And so some of the things that are the same versus what's actually different about them. The location of the pits with the arrow on the top is going to be slightly different. So upper versus lower lip. And then also if you look at the head of the snake close, so if you get a chance, you can do this. The python is going to have very tiny scales all over its head, and that tree boa is going to have much larger scales on its face. And so that's, you got to be up close and personal to tell that. But similarly, they are arboreal, eat small mammals, sometimes birds. People think these tree boas eat a lot of birds, but if you do a diet study, you find out they mostly eat arboreal mammals. And they're found in South American rainforests. The green tree python, also arboreal, eats mammals, occasionally birds. But these snakes are found in Australia and New Guinea, but also specifically in rainforests. So to me, this is just one of the most excellent examples out there of real convergent evolution where everything really lines up nicely. And that doesn't always happen. The next thing I want to talk about, one of my favorites, if you've seen me give talks before, is our spider-tailed horned viper, which is something we have here in the collection. This was an unknown until 2006 species, but it was first collected back in 1968. And I think a lot of people are familiar with this, but for those who are not, this is because this snake, people who collected it thought it was just, it had a tumor on the end of its tail, or maybe it had a parasite. And they just said, oh, it's the same as this other species. We know all about it. Throw it in a jar on a shelf and we'll never think about it again. But in the late 90s or early 2000s, another one was found in Iran. And it had the same funny little doodad that I'm going to show up close on the end of its tail. And somebody said, the Field Museum has one of those. And so lo and behold, it was determined this actually is a separate species, potentially the most sophisticated luring system out there of any snake that exists. And I'm going to show a quick video. And I'm just going to move right into that. I want to point out that we don't have a live one for the exhibit, unfortunately. The holotype is the only US specimen there is that's here in the Field Museum. But I will say Janice Lim has done an amazing job making models for this exhibit. And so this is the early stages of her working on the spider-tailed viper. And we'll see if this video I have actually works. I can figure out, here we go, how to get this.
The spider-tailed horned viper is truly remarkable.
And so this is this funny looking tail, all right?
What sets this viper apart?
And the snake is sitting right there, not moving in between the bird. And there you go. This bird's not too smart. Right, he comes back for more. He could have gotten away the first time. And you can see just because of this landscape, how hard it would be to find live specimens of this thing. These birds just keep on going back for more almost every single time. So it's too bad we don't have a live one, but the model is going to be really cool. And we have I'm showing you kind of some B level footage of this snake. There is going to be some beautiful footage that was bought specifically to show to go with the model in the exhibit. So you'll have to go see it. It's from the BBC and it is definitely worth, David Attenborough is amazing. We're not going to hear him talk, but it is a David Attenborough special. And I just want to also point out that if we take a look, there's what that tail really looks like on this snake. And it's one of the first things, it's the first thing I had CT scanned in our new CT scanning facility here. And so Stephanie Smith kindly did this as one of the first individuals during the testing of the XCT lab. And so there's going to be a publication coming out showing this sometime, hopefully in the next year. And there's so much more. So those are sort of my in-depth stories, but I'm going to walk through a few very small examples of other things to check out when you go to this exhibit. So there's 20 species of reptiles. There's actually 21 because there are 2 of one species hanging out in the same enclosure. This includes things like this dwarf crocodile, a spitting cobra, I was walking through the exhibit yesterday, and what I loved is the animals aren't here yet. They come next week on a private plane. And the cobra exhibit, because this is a spitting cobra, it has all the decor for the tank is in there, plus a face shield. Because the person who works with that snake, anytime they are actually interacting or doing things, they have to wear a face shield to protect their eyes, just in case the snake gets excited. And also a juvenile American alligator there as well. And so we're gonna have a really nice assortment of not things you would just see in a pet store or see in every zoo. One of the other aspects of this is the live animals obviously are great, but this is a museum and there's some museum stories that need to be told to go with it. So it's not just like going to a zoo. And one of these is about another former herpetology curator, Carl Schmidt, who was killed by a boomslang back in the 1950s. And so people are familiar with this story, but I want to talk a little bit about trying to get a live boomslang for the exhibit, which is one of the things I wanted to do because I thought, oh, we're going to highlight Schmidt and his contributions to science, right? And I thought, boy, it would be so amazing to have a boomslang for this. So boomslangs are special because I talked earlier when I was talking about that Gila monster about cobras or rattlesnakes, and they've got these fangs in the front of their mouth. But there are snakes that are rear fanged, and they have sometimes an enlarged tooth in the back of their mouth. And they don't have, similar to the Gila monster, they don't have this sophisticated venom delivery system. Instead, they work the fang in and they've got toxins flowing through their saliva and they work it in there. And in general, this is not super effective, nor is it usually dangerous for humans. Most rear-fanged snakes are medically non-important, would be the word for it. But boomslangs are one of the exceptions to this, and a bite from a boomslang is extremely serious. And they have that fang that they have is also larger, right, than the average rear-fanged snake. And they really, their venom is quite toxic and causes a lot of problems if you get bit by one. This is something where you're going to need anti-venom treatment. And the anti-venom for this snake is really what the big hang-up was on getting one for the exhibit. It wasn't about acquiring a boomslang that was problematic. So you'll notice it says monovalent boomslang anti-venom. Monovalent means it only works against one snake. Some snakes, like a group of snakes like rattlesnakes, if you, anywhere in the United States, if you got bit by a rattlesnake, and there's like 30 species, there's not just one, you got bit by a rattlesnake, you got bit by a water moccasin, you're gonna take the same polyvalent anti-venom. If you go to the hospital, you're gonna take this anti-venom. It works against all sorts of pit vipers that we have here in the United States. That's a polyvalent anti-venom. Boomslangs, it's just one anti-venom. It's the only one that works for them. And when we chatted with the Clyde Peeling folks about, could we get a boomslang? Could we replace one of these other animals with a boomslang? Because it would be so nice to illustrate this. They said, well, here's the real problem. We keep anti-venom on hand for every species of venomous snake in the exhibit because you don't know that a hospital is going to have something for an exotic animal, and our Crofab, which is our polyvalent venom here in the United States, it might work for the rattlesnake, but it's not going to work for the spitting cobra. And so we have to get boomslang anti-venom. And I don't know, you know, how if you got bit by something, your health insurance would pay for it in the hospital, but to buy it preemptively, to have it on hand, there's no insurance that's going to be paying for that. You're going to pay for that out of pocket to have it on hand. And they said we need at least 20 vials of anti-venom, and it's about $3,500 a vial. And that was the end of talking about getting a boomslang. So it's a lot of money. There's other reasons to consider not getting one that I could discuss further, but I don't want to spend too much more time on it. But I still thought, boy, it would be cool to have something representing this to go with our homage to Schmidt. And so one, we have a mangrove snake, which comes with the exhibit. This is a live animal that'll be in there. They are also rear-fanged. They're not medically important. They're only mildly toxic, but they are very cool and very beautiful. And that's great. So now we have a rear-fanged snake, but I still thought, you know, I'd really like something more to do with a boomslang. And so it was suggested, why don't we make a new model, a beautiful replica of one? And so last week, this is from the Field Museum's Instagram. This is the boomslang model that Janice Lim also, she's so talented, made. And I just want to point out some of the comments, and there were a lot of comments. The comments are all we thought it was real. We thought you were being very stupid and were trying to get bit because it's the video of her attaching the tongue to the model. And so it looks like she's getting right up in there with her tweezers. And people were very impressed. The reception on Instagram to just this 5-second video of the model was outstanding. So I was so excited when I saw that. It looks really, really, really good. Maybe it can live in my office when the exhibit's over. Another thing I want to point out that was very important to me was this is what the animal enclosures that come with the live animals look like. The backgrounds of them, right? So that there's one there that's blue, there's one there that's beige, some of them are green. There isn't anything else to that. And this is not, again, this is not a zoo and this is not a pet store. And to me, what is it? I thought long and hard, what is it about being in a museum with the exhibits that's different than that? How can we have live animals here and make it be a museum exhibit and not feel like a zoo? And I thought it's because when you go and look at the dioramas, especially the mammal dioramas or some of the birds that are on the main hall, they are historical, right? This is natural history. Those backgrounds are a specific place that that animal lives. And I thought that was so important. And I said, what we need to do, if it's possible, and I will say exhibits made it possible. So I was so thankful. These backgrounds, we need to somehow put backgrounds on these that are of a specific place that this animal is found in the wild to put it into that natural history perspective. And so this is the Gila monster one, and it looks so beautiful, right? The background looks amazing in this. I mean, the Gila monster's not in there yet, but he'll make it look even better. But this is a real place, right? Saguaro National Park in Arizona. This is a place Gila monsters live. It puts it into that natural history perspective, and there will be information saying where each location is, just the way some of the Akeley dioramas say, this is a specific scene from a specific place. And so that was really important to me, and I was so happy that we were able to make it work. I also want to point out there's a little like Easter egg, I guess we call it, of something in one of the backgrounds. So there are a couple animals in the exhibit from Madagascar. And one of the Madagascar backgrounds, when we were choosing and going through different locations and different stock photos of locations that would work in the right resolution, we chose one for one of the Malagasy animals. And then once it was blown up and on the background, I thought, there's actually a chameleon in the background of the background that we chose. And so when you're in there, take a good hard look. It is not, the clue is it's not in the chameleon enclosure. So we do have a beautiful panther chameleon similar to the one that's in the background. It's the same species, but it is not in the chameleon enclosure. So look out for that. It's very tiny, but that is what that is actually a picture that I took in the exhibit of that. So check it out. And then there's a focus also on local reptiles, including some of the work I've done here around Chicago towards the end, and highlights you don't have to go to the tropics, you don't have to go around the world, you can go out in your own backyard and see a huge diversity of reptiles and amphibians. And so that was another thing that sort of closes out the exhibit when you walk through is back here in Illinois or just back in the United States, right? We have cool stuff. We have alligators, we've got all sorts of snakes, all sorts of lizards, turtles, lots and lots of turtles. And so that's something that is highlighted really nicely when you get to the end of the exhibit as well. And so I want to thank everybody for coming and learning more about this awesome exhibit. There's a lot of people here who are thanked here. I don't know that I want to call everybody out here, but I know Ben, who was the developer for this with me. Thank you so much for putting up with all my can we do this sort of questions. I want to thank Mary and Bruce Fay, who are here in the audience and have supported a lot of the work that I've done over the last several years since I've been at the museum. Chun, who also put up with a lot of requests about specimens we needed. You know, everybody who's worked on the Chicago work with the Walder stuff with me, in particular, Madeline and Tom Anton are here today. And so if there's anybody I'm not mentioning specifically, I thank you too. And with that, I'd be happy if we have time to take any questions that anyone might have that, you know, unless it's top secret information, I'll answer them. Thank you.
Hi, Sarah. I have a question. Sorry, I got handed a microphone. I apologize if I spooked you. So you talked about, the python doesn't need to be fed very often and 40 feet, that's a lot of pace, I imagine we have for this creature. How do we know when he's hungry and then what do you give him?
So that's a excellent point. How do you know when a snake that doesn't eat that often is hungry? So I have a small python at home and he eats more frequently than every several months. But basically it's the same signs that you're looking for. And also these zookeepers, I'll point out, the exhibit comes with a zookeeper who takes care of the animals. It's not anybody here who's responsible for them. And so that zookeeper is very familiar. They are a permanent staff member from the permanent exhibit in Pennsylvania. So they have a schedule for this snake that I'm sure they've worked out over the years. It takes a long time to get 14 feet long. So they know him very well. The other thing though is that snakes, when they feel content and full, they kind of just sit there. And then when they start being slightly more active and you walk by and maybe they pick their head up and flick their tongue, and this is from my own experience, when my python at home stops being in one of his little hiding spots and starts having his head sticking out all the time, I know he's probably wondering when I'm gonna give him something to eat. And I don't know what they're sourcing exactly for this snake, but I suspect it's rabbits. Not live, cute rabbits, you know, that are from outside here. These are rabbits that are gonna come pre-killed, I'm sure, and frozen. But I'm sure it's, I'm not sure it's rabbits, but it's probably rabbits, because that's the right size for a snake that big, big rabbits. I don't have the microphone, so I'll just keep your hand up and somebody will come and bring it to you.
Hi. I was wondering, for the Gila monster,
Mhm.
why does it have venom if it usually goes for prey that can't really do anything about being eaten?
That is an excellent question, right? Why would this Gila monster bother to even produce venom? And so that's sort of an open-ended question that might not have an exact, here is the exact right answer and here is why. But one thing that venom does beyond just cause prey to die is venom, if you think about something like a spider that injects venom as well into its prey, especially for something like a spider, it's not just to immobilize the prey, it starts the digestion process inside the prey item. And that is true for snake venom as well, and also for Gila monsters. And so it might also have that as part of it. But you know, I mean, these Gila monsters do eat things that could fight back sometimes. And it's just gonna be a more efficient way to chow down on stuff. But is it wholly necessary? Maybe not, right? But it might not be causing any problems either. It might not be too expensive to produce. It's also been proposed that, I talked a little bit about that GLP-1 association with the venom protein. I read something when I was putting this talk together, you know, I wanted to make sure I was, you know, current about as much that was known about it beyond, well, we don't know what it does. But it might be that it also has something to do with that lizard being able to sit underground doing nothing for really long periods of time, that there are venom components that have a lot more to do with that than anything else. So secondarily, that venom might be doing a lot of really good things for the Gila monster that aren't just about immobilizing prey very quickly.
I had a question about the python. You've had a python for quite a while.
Yes.
How long do they live in the wild and in captivity?
So in the wild, life is always a lot rougher, right, for most animals. I can say, thinking about snakes that have been radio tracked and tagged over years, there are, in the US, say timber rattlesnakes, there's been a lot of studies on them. Wild ones can be living up to 20 years. Something big like a python, like a really big python or a big anaconda or a boa, when you get that big, you don't have that many predators anymore. So you don't necessarily need to worry a lot about something coming to eat you. And snakes are not necessarily prone to a lot of the diseases that mammals are that take them out in old age, right? One thing that ruins mammals, that say a wolf, wolves in captivity live a really long time compared to wild wolves. That tends to get them in the end is their teeth, right? Their teeth rot out of their head. They can't catch food anymore. Obviously, other things can happen. Snakes, they don't chew their food. They're all set. They don't need, their teeth are not subjected to the same kind of rigors that something like a wild mammal is. So a wild snake, if it gets big enough and doesn't have any direct predators, can be hitting 30 or 40 years probably in the wild the biggest threat to a big wild snake is gonna be humans, for sure. In captivity, over 50 years, for sure. Even a little python like mine is already 33 years old, and that species is known to make it up to 50+ years. And so I don't know if there's any oldest known snake in existence as far as something like a big python, but for some of the species in captivity, that is known, and it's over 50 years.
Sarah, really good talk. Enjoyed that and look forward to the exhibit.
Yeah.
My question was, you mentioned the interesting parallel between the two green pythons and boas
Yeah.
and how they drape over the branches. I wonder if that might be partly just a physical constraint and a matter of physics. And okay, if you want to sit on a branch,
This is the way you have to do it.
that's
If
what
you
kinda have
are,
to do it. And if most other snakes don't do that, the fact that they're constrictors may mean something different about their muscles that makes it easier or necessary or something.
without being an expert on the musculature in those snakes, I'm gonna say that that is almost certainly the reason, is that the musculature on these bigger, heavy-bodied constrictors, I think that's probably the way it has to be done in order to be able to sit there. Because other arboreal snakes that are just as arboreal, they don't do it in that pattern. And whether or not they are constrictors, they just aren't as heavy bodied of a snake. And so it definitely has something to do with, I think, the combination of you're gonna sit on a branch and your body is this shape. This is maybe the only effective way to do it, that you can contort yourself and be comfortable. So I do think it has something to do exactly what you said.
Thanks.
So the question about longevity of snakes actually got me curious about their growth rates. So do they keep growing their whole lives, or does it stop at any point? And is it like domestic boas and pythons will get much bigger than?
So snakes and other reptiles, they all basically have indeterminate growth where they never stop growing. They grow their entire lives. However, they grow really fast when they're young, and they grow a lot more slowly once they hit sexual maturity. And it varies across reptiles in general. If there's sexual dimorphism as far as size, it can vary between who's bigger, whether it's the male or the female. In some snakes, the anacondas would be a great example of this. Females are a lot bigger. And that makes sense from the perspective of, well, you want to have a lot of babies. You want to have lots and lots of babies, get as big as you possibly can, as quickly as you can, and then start reproducing. Male snakes, for anacondas at least, they don't get nearly as big because they reach whatever a critical size is, where sperm production is probably as good as it's going to get. You're big enough to eat the kinds of stuff that's around, that's good and energetically efficient. And you can put all your energy now into reproducing. And so in some species, it makes sense that females get much bigger because it has to do with being able to have a lot of babies. In other species, males might be territorial and combative. And so in those species, and I think this is similar across other groups of animals, males get bigger because they fight with each other over territory and then mate with the females that live in that territory. And so in those cases, you might see the males getting sizably larger. But in some species of snakes and in some species of turtles also, there's a huge, like you can look at them and be like, oh, it's clearly, if you can tell that they're mature adults, you can clearly tell them apart. It also seems, this is a little bit of an, I'm gonna say anecdote, that if you have something in captivity, snakes in particular, but all of these animals, how big they get is directly related to how much do they eat. And the more you feed them, the bigger they're gonna get. And it seems to me that the more you feed them when they're young and growing at that fastest rate is going to give you a bigger max size as an adult. Of course, individual genetics play a role in all of this, just like in any other kind of animal.
Yeah, thanks for a real nice talk, by the way. And another question about venom.
Yeah.
Is something like the Gila monster or another one with the back. Fang.
Yeah, the rear fang
Does
snake,
it,
the boom
does it
slime.
have the anti-venom in its bloodstream, and why is the venom not harmful to the animal?
So how this is accomplished, so in snakes, when they are feeding, it is not uncommon that a snake it's striking at something, it might bite itself. That can definitely happen. And so why doesn't that kill that individual snake? And so this might vary across different species exactly how it's accomplished. But basically, if you have something like a cobra that's gonna have venom that clogs up your nervous system by blocking all these sodium channels. The cobra's own sodium channels will have these little things that kind of stick out that make it so the venom can't attach. And so it gives them it basically makes the venom ineffective against their own venom. So they've got it solved. Now, there might be exceptions to that though, so I'm, you know, because usually there are, but that is one way that it's done so that they are not affected if they bite themselves while feeding. All right, if there are no other questions, thank you all so much for coming. I can't wait for everyone to check out the exhibit. I love that.